When I was in kindergarten, I had an enemy at the end of our apartment building. Now, I can't remember his name, but he was a bad kid. He was always kind of mean, but then one day he crossed the line. We were arguing or something, and he got mad, and he grabbed my hand, and he pulled it up to his mouth, and he bit my finger hard. Like, who does that? And I pulled it out in shock, and it really hurt, and I really tried to tough it out, but it hurt too bad, and I started to cry. So for him, when he saw me crying, panic immediately set in, and the first thing he said was, please don't tell your mom. Please don't tell your mom. Well, as I got my tears under control, I decided that I was going to tough it out. I wasn't going to tell my mom. I didn't want to be a wuss. I'm 6. I count my age on 2 hands now. So I didn't tell her. But I also wasn't going to be this kid's friend at all anymore. I already didn't like him, but now officially we were enemies. And officially, we started a battle. A couple of days later, we started threatening each other in a funny 6-year-old kind of way. He walked out of his garage at the end of the apartment complex, and he held up his baseball bat. So I thought, okay, dude, you want to threaten me with a bat? So I ran back in the garage, broke my dad's rules, opened up his golf bag, took out a golf club, went back outside and held it up to him. So he was like, okay. He ran back inside his garage. He came running back out, but this time he had a hockey stick. And I thought, okay. So I ran in the garage and I came back out. And again, risking getting in trouble, I grabbed my dad's BB gun. Now I was a little scared because, I wasn't supposed to be touching his stuff. But I really needed it for this showdown, so I grabbed it. And it looked like a German Luger, so he probably thought it was real. I don't care, this is war. So then he runs out into his garage, comes back out, and he's got a bow and arrow. And I'm like, try that against a Luger, you loser. So the next thing I did was I came out with this. I don't know if any of you guys know what that is. I didn't know what it was, and I didn't care. It looked intimidating. And I needed a weapon, so I ran out with that thing, right? Apparently they're like grass clippers, like an old school edger, which makes me thankful that we have electricity now. So anyway, the kid runs back in his garage, and he runs back out this time, but this time he's got his bike. And I thought, that is a stupid weapon. What are you going to do with your bike? So he starts like running with it, trying to showcase what he's going to do. And he starts running at me, and he kind of stutter steps, and he loses the grip of his bike, and it starts rolling at me. And since we're 5 or 6, he's got training wheels on it, so it doesn't fall over. And so his bike is just barreling at me. So he starts running after his bike to get it, but he trips over his feet, and he falls down and skins his knees. And so I'm standing there, and I have this bike barreling at me, and I'm like, I hadn't thought this far ahead. I didn't know we were actually going to come in contact with each other. So I took my, bladed weapon and started running at the bike. And as I'm running, I'm like, I don't know what to do. What am I going to do when his bike gets here and all I have is these grass clippers? So I did the first thing that made sense. I put the scissors around the tire of his bike and I started crunching on it. All right? Now, here's the thing. That thing was like 50 years old. I'm only 6 years old. You think those scissors did anything to the bike tire? No, not a thing, right? So the kid gets up and he starts running up to me and he grabs his bike and he pushes my hands off and he screams and he runs back to his house and he's crying and he goes inside and he shuts the garage. And I thought, I won. At that moment, I won the most epic battle that I would ever take part in. Maybe not, but I felt pretty good afterwards. I got on my big wheel and I rode around the parking lot. This is my territory now. And I just waited for him to challenge me again, but the truth is he never did. We actually ended up becoming friends right before I moved away. But I never forgot my great victory when I became king of the condominiums. Well, today, church, we're going to look at another epic setup for an epic battle. We're going to be starting to look at the second half of the tribulation now. And it begins with God launching his plagues on the earth. And it's followed up by setting up a very, very famous battle, one that I am sure that you have heard of before. Okay? But before we get into that, I want to go ahead and recap where we are in our series in case you're new here, you haven't been following along, or you just need a refresher. So our first message in this series was called The Introduction. We learned that John is on an island called Patmos, and he receives a future revelation from Jesus. In the second message, called The Churches, Jacob taught us that there were 7 ancient churches in Asia Minor that got a report card. Some of them were good, some of them were bad, but most got a little bit of both. In the third message, called The Problem, John goes to heaven and he sees God, but he can't get to him. There's a separation. And so in the midst of that, a scroll shows up, which is essentially like the title deed to the earth, and no one can open it. But Jesus walks in and he is declared to be worthy to open this scroll. In the next message, it was called The Process. This scroll had 7 seals on it, and Jesus begins to open each of these 7 seals, which starts the 7-year tribulation period. Now, I believe that the rapture happens at this point, and then as the seals are opened, each seal brings something bad. Then the final seal starts another series of 7, the 7 trumpets, and 7 more bad things happen, okay? At that point, we got to the middle of the tribulation period, and so halfway through the 7 years, we get an update. There is a 3rd temple that is built for Jews to worship God in. There are 2 witnesses that have been preaching this whole time, but they are killed and then resurrected. And then the final trumpet sounds, completing the final seal, and Jesus becomes the owner of the earth. Now, last week, we looked at a message called The Players. John kind of stops, and he gives kind of this scorecard, this roster sheet, of the 7 players in the end times drama. And those 7 players were Israel, Satan, Jesus, Michael the Archangel, the Tribulation Saints, the Antichrist, and the false prophet. So that brings us to today. If you're following along with your sermon notes today, today's message is called The Plagues. We're in chapters 14 through 18, looking at the second half of the tribulation. Now, chapter 14 opens up with 144,000 people. In Revelation 14:1, it says, "Then I looked, and behold, on Mount Zion stood the Lamb, and with him 144,000 who had his name and his Father's name written on their foreheads." So when we last left off, the false prophet made everyone follow the Antichrist rules. You'll remember that they had to get a mark either on their hand or on their forehead, either being the name of the beast or the number 666. If you don't get that mark, you don't get to buy or sell anything, okay? But then we see this 144,000 show up, and they have marks too, but it's not 666. Instead, it's the name of the Father in heaven. And there are a few things that we learn about this group as we read about them. Number 1, they're Jewish. Number 2, they're Christians. Number 3, they're male virgins. Number 4, they speak the truth. And number 5, they are blameless. Okay? So these Jewish, Christian, male, virgin, blameless truth seekers are protected by God at that point, okay? From God's wrath, they are protected. Now, there are lots of questions about this group of 144,000 people. Is it a literal number? Maybe. Is it a symbolic number? Maybe. Does it start with 144,000 and then grow because they're evangelizing? Could be. No matter what, it seems that God takes this group of people who declare truth and he protects them from what he is going to do next. That's why they are sealed, but it doesn't mean that Satan can't get them. Okay, Satan and the Antichrist go after these people, but God is protecting them from his own wrath. Or at least, and this group seems to be part of that group called the offspring that we looked at last week. And we see later on in chapter 15 that some of these tribulation saints die in the tribulation, even though they're protected from God's judgment, because the Antichrist persecutes them and they end up in heaven. And they show up with harps and they sing songs to God the Father and God the Son. And this happens likely as they are killed by the Antichrist and his servants. Well, then the rest of chapter 14 just gives an overview of the rest of what we're going to see today. So we're not going to read from chapter 14 anymore. We're going to look through chapters 15 through 18 to fill in the blanks of what chapter 14 actually talks about. So let's go ahead and hop into Revelation chapter 15, verse 1. It says this: "Then I saw another sign in heaven, great and amazing, 7 angels with 7 plagues, which are the last. For with them the wrath of God is finished." So up to this point, this has been kind of a bad experience for the earth. You know, some bad stuff has happened, and you know, we've seen the wrath of the Lamb already. We've seen the wrath of Satan. But now we're going to see the wrath of God the Father. And God's wrath is going to just finish the job, okay? Everything is going to be destroyed at this point. Now here's how this happens in Revelation 15:6. It says, "And out of the sanctuary came the 7 angels with the 7 plagues, clothed in pure bright linen, with golden sashes around their chests. And one of the 4 living creatures gave to the 7 angels 7 golden bowls full of the wrath of God, who lives forever and ever." So now we get to these 7 plagues of the wrath of God. This is how the tribulation period is going to finish. And these are known as the bowl judgments. Now, we already saw 7 seals and 7 trumpets, and now we're going to get 7 bowls. Or another word that would be translated here could be 7 vials or 7 goblets, okay? So these are small bowls. This isn't a big bowl. These are smaller things. And you can imagine that if God was sitting there and he had this huge like punch bowl of his wrath in it, okay? You can imagine then that these angels are told to get their little goblets and just scoop up a portion of God's wrath, okay? And that's what they're doing. And at that moment, these angels, they go up to the bowl of God's judgment and they scoop up his wrath and they start going to the earth. And at that moment, smoke fills the temple or the throne room of God. And it's so smoky in there that everybody has to get out. They can't stay there in God's presence as this smoke is being offered. So everybody leaves and they have to stay gone until the judgment is done. Now at the beginning of chapter 16, the angels take those goblets that they filled up with God's wrath, and they go up to the earth and they dump them out on the earth one by one. So just like Jesus and the other sevens, they're grouped into 4 and then 3. You'll remember that the 7 seals had 4 horsemen and 3 disasters. The trumpets had 4 fire judgments and 3 woes. Well, now the 7 bowls are also going to have a 4-3 pattern. Let me show you. Revelation 16:2. Let's read through the first 4 bowls. So the first angel went and poured out his bowl on the earth, and harmful and painful sores came upon the people who bore the mark of the beast and worshipped its image. The second angel poured out his bowl into the sea, and it became like the blood of a corpse, and every living thing died that was in the sea. The third angel poured out his bowl into the rivers and the springs of water, and they became blood. And we jump down to verse 8, and it says, the fourth angel poured out his bowl on the sun, and it was allowed to scorch people with fire. So these bowls look very similar to the seals that we already saw, but the difference is with those seals, it was like a third of the plants died, a third of the sea creatures died, etc., right? Well, in this case, here's your first fill in the blank, church. The 7 bowls finish what the seals have started. The 7 bowls finish what the seals have started. These judgments from God affect the entire world. It's not just a third of the population or a third of the sea creatures anymore. Now the entire world is being destroyed thoroughly, okay? All the sea creatures are dead. All the rivers turn to blood. The entire atmosphere no longer protects humans from UV rays, and it just scorches them. And we're not even done with the bowls yet. Here's the 5th bowl. It says that the 5th bowl is dumped out on the Antichrist's throne, Revelation 16:10. The 5th angel poured out his bowl on the throne of the beast, and its kingdom was plunged into darkness. People gnawed their tongues in anguish and cursed the God of heaven for their pain and sores. They did not repent of their deeds. So God goes directly after the beast at this point, the Antichrist. There's no question there. But look at what his followers do. They curse God. They curse him. They still don't repent, though, which is crazy to think about that, right? Like, you know that this is God. You are cursing him, but you still won't repent. Well, church, it's funny how often people do this even now. I had a conversation with an unbeliever on my Twitch stream, I don't know, a couple months ago. She grew up in a Christian home, but she turned away from God in her 20s. And after she and we talked for a while, something became very obvious to me. She still believes in God. She's just mad at him, which is very different. So here's your next fill in the blank, church. Many unsaved know there is a God, they just don't like him. Many unsaved know there is a God, they just don't like him. She doesn't like how people in the church treated her and other people. She doesn't like that God has rules. She doesn't like that her parents are hypocrites. But even with all that, she still can't deny that God is real, and yet she refuses to follow him. There are lots of people in this world that believe in God and just don't like him. And that's what we're going to see here at the end. The followers of the beast know there is a God, but they choose to curse him instead of repenting. Church, that is the definition of depravity. Knowing that there is goodness, knowing there is a God, knowing he's authoritative, but refusing to worship him anyway. And then we get to the 6th bowl. Now this bowl is really, really interesting. Revelation 16:12. The 6th angel poured out his bowl on the great river Euphrates, and its water was dried up to prepare the way for the kings from the east. And I saw coming out of the mouth of the dragon, and out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet, 3 unclean spirits like frogs. For they are demonic spirits performing signs who go abroad to the kings of the whole world to assemble them for battle on the great day of God the Almighty. So this bowl starts to set up these things for this great final battle, sort of final battle. The Euphrates dries up, so nations from the east of there come in to fight. Now this could be a lot of different nations, because east of the Euphrates is half of Iraq, parts of Syria, and Turkey, Iran, Afghanistan, all the Soviet stands, Russia, China, Pakistan, India. All of those countries are east of the Euphrates River. But it also says that then all of the nations are called to come in and support this fight. And this battle is going to take place in a very specific valley in the Middle East, a place that the Jews call the Valley of Jezreel, just below a hill that is called Megiddo. Not the disc golf park in Morton, but different. And in Hebrew, it is this word, a word you've probably heard before, Armageddon. Anybody ever heard the word Armageddon before? A few of us? Most of us? All of us? Here's your next fill in the blank, church. The Battle of Armageddon is set up at the end of the tribulation. The Battle of Armageddon is set up at the end of the tribulation. This is the only place the word Armageddon appears. Now, Megiddo appears a few times, but Armageddon is only here. And lots of people know this word, but not so many people realize that this refers specifically to this one battle at the end of the tribulation. Armageddon is not an asteroid that Bruce Willis blows up with a nuke, while Steven Tyler sings, "I don't want to close my eyes." Some of you are the right age to understand that reference. No, Armageddon is this place right here. Here's a picture of actually the valley of Megiddo there, or under the valley underneath the hill of Megiddo. This patch of land is the largest flat terrain in the entire country of Israel. It's 50 miles wide and 100 miles long. That's how long this battlefield is. It's called the breadbasket of Israel, where many of the Old Testament battles were fought. Now here these froggish demons line everyone up, and the army of the Antichrist is set to fight against the army of Christ. And at that moment, the final bowl is poured out, Revelation 16:17. It says, "The seventh angel poured out his bowl into the air, and a loud voice came out of the temple from the throne saying, 'It is done.'" So this voice of God the Father comes down from the throne, and it makes this powerful pronouncement. It is over. Everything is done. The earth is finished. To the world, you lose. To the church, we win. Here's your next fill in the blank, church. The tribulation ends at the final bowl. Now, the details in the book of Revelation are very important, right? It's important that we learn the details of this book. However, this part here is the unchanging final message that we see throughout the entire book that we cannot forget as we read the book of Revelation. And that message is simply, God wins. We can't forget that. That is the hope that everything relies on. That is the linchpin of everything that we talk about. That God wins this ultimate final victory against the world. That is our hope. And then suddenly, at that moment, we see the biggest earthquake to ever strike the earth. The big one, so to speak. Islands in the sea sink. Mountains crumble. Cities fall. And this city called Babylon is split into 3 pieces. This is a great city who is associated with a harlot, which actually paints a very beautiful picture for us. You remember when we looked at Hosea in our prophet series? Hosea married Gomer, the prostitute, to illustrate what Israel had done, that just like Hosea married a prostitute, that God was dealing with Israel, who was acting like a prostitute. And at that point, Israel had to make a choice, either be a faithful bride to God or be a harlot like Gomer and go after the world. And Israel chose the second one. And so this image begins to resurface in Revelation 17. This is a big chunk, so we're going to read this here. Revelation 17, 3-6. "And he carried me away in the Spirit into a wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names, and it had 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet and adorned with gold and jewels and pearls, holding in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and the impurities of her sexual immorality. And on her forehead was written a name of mystery, Babylon the Great, mother of prostitutes and of earth's abominations. And I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints, the blood of the martyrs of Jesus." So there's this image here of this woman riding the beast, and she is a prostitute with stuff written on her forehead. Remember we talked about how Satan, and the Antichrist and the false prophet was the parody of the Trinity, right? That Father, Son, Holy Spirit were parodied by Satan, Antichrist, and false prophet. Well, the harlot then seems to be a parody of the church. This is a false religion. It is a false faith. Just like the true church worships Christ, the false one worships Antichrist. In Revelation, John uses these words for the church and the harlot. We see that the church is in heaven, but the harlot is in the wilderness. We see the church returns with Christ, but the harlot comes riding on the beast. The church is adorned in righteousness, but the harlot is adorned in luxury. The church has the water of life, but the harlot has the cup of abominations. The church will make up a holy city. The harlot makes up a great city. And in the future, the city of God is going to be made up by the church, and the spiritual and the political are going to come together. That's what our future holds. Right now, there is a separation of church and state. That's what we buy into now. In the future, that is not what we're going to buy into. We're going to buy into a church and state together. However, it's going to be a good thing because it's going to be run by a benevolent king named Jesus. That's why that system will work. Well, that's what Jesus is going to put together. So likewise, the harlot is a false church, and it also makes up a false, it's a real political city, but an evil political city. So Jesus is going to bring government and religion together. Well, that's also what this harlot does. It's a false religion that brings the political world and the religious world together. Now, this might be done something like how the Pope and the Vatican work together, or maybe like Saddam Hussein and how he tried to rebuild Babylon, or like Kim Jong-un is worshipped in North Korea. It could be something like that. In fact, when John sees this, he marvels at the harlot riding on the beast, and the angel says, John, relax, I'm going to tell you exactly who she is. Here's what he says in Revelation 17:18. And the woman that you saw is the great city that has dominion over the kings of the earth. So there's been a lot of conversations over who this city might be. Some people think this is literally the same ancient city as Babylon, just, resurrected. Saddam Hussein did try to rebuild it and make it a tourist destination when he was alive. But it seems unlikely, as John calls this a mystery. If it's the same city as old Babylon, it's not very mysterious, right? It's exactly what you would expect. Now, some people think this is Rome, or perhaps the Catholic Church again. Some think it's the United States. Some think it's some sort of a power that doesn't exist yet. Church, what do you think I'm going to say? I don't know. I have no clue who this is. What I do know is there will be an interesting twist for this harlot, this false religion. Revelation 17:16. And the 10 horns that you saw, they and the beast will hate the prostitute. They will make her desolate and naked and devour her flesh and burn her up with fire. For God has put it into their hearts to carry out his purpose by being of one mind and handing over their royal power to the beast until the words of God are fulfilled. So the beast and his allies are going to turn against this false religion that worships him. He's going to turn on his own people. Which brings up our next fill in the blank. The Antichrist destroys his own followers. The Antichrist destroys his own followers. That means he never actually cared for the people who end up following him. When he's done with them, he just throws them away. He kills them all. This church is another distinction between Christ and his church and the Antichrist and his religion. Christ loves his church. He builds his church, while the Antichrist hates and destroys his church. There's that old saying, better to rule in hell than to serve in heaven. Anybody ever heard that before? I think it's from a movie, maybe. Well, when it comes to Satan and his games, there is no you ruling in hell. It doesn't work like that. All there is from Satan is trickery and hatred. You're not going to have a good time when Satan is your host. Don't think for a minute that hell on earth or hell anywhere else is a good time. Now, finally, in chapter 18, we see the political side of Babylon. We saw the religious side of Babylon. Now we'll look at the political side. Revelation 18:1. After this, I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was made bright with his glory. And he called out with a mighty voice, Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a dwelling place for demons, a haunt for every unclean spirit, a haunt for every unclean bird, a haunt for every unclean and detestable beast. For all nations have drunk the wine of the passion of her sexual immorality. And the kings of the earth have committed immorality with her, and the merchants of the earth have grown rich from the power of her luxurious living. So the greatest city on earth at this time is going to crumble. And in this chapter, we see a bunch of people start to lament and mourn the loss of this great city. Kings and merchants and shipping moguls, they cry out and they weep and they throw dirt on their faces as they mourn. You know why? Because they all lose their money. They lose their money and they weep. Church, materialism is a very powerful force. It is today, and it will be in the end times. In 2008, when the Great Recession started, male suicides jumped 9% that year. It was 13% in Europe. In 1997, Asia had a similar crisis, which increased their suicide rates by more than 10,000 people. Why? Because without money, those people believed they had no hope. Their hope was in one thing. When it was gone, they had nowhere left to turn, so they took their lives. That's why it's so important for us as Americans today to be careful how we view money. As Christian Americans today, we have to be careful how we see money. Money is a blessing, and it is a tool from God, but if we lose it, He is still our source for comfort and provision, even if the money is gone. Now, church, I recommend that you even ask these questions of yourself right now. There are three questions we should ask ourselves whenever we want to figure out, is materialism our God? Here's your first question. Number one, is your stuff your identity? Is it your identity? Our identity should be in Christ, not our stuff. If you believe a big house or a nice car or expensive clothes is going to make people like you, you are wrong. Nobody cares about what you wear. Nobody cares about what you drive. And if they do, they're probably jealous and hate you anyway. Or they're rich and they think that they're better than you. And they think you should admire them for what they have. Do you admire them? Do you look at somebody who passes you on the highway in a Tesla or a Maserati or whatever and go, that guy's really cool? I don't even really think about it, right? I'm just so busy trying to deal with you guys tailgating me all the time out here in Illinois. No, church, our identity is in Christ alone, not our stuff. Number two, your second question, are you responsible with your money? Will you make poor decisions to stretch yourself beyond your means? Getting unreasonable credit cards, high interest loans, borrowing money from people all the time? Are you being irresponsible with money? If you are, it's probably because you have an unhealthy view of it, right? You're making bad decisions to try to make it work for you out of desperation. Because you want the stuff so bad, you'll do something you shouldn't be doing. And the third question is this: are you content with what you have? We shouldn't be envious of what we don't have. Instead, we should seek to be content with what we do have. More stuff is not going to fill that hole in your heart. Only Jesus can do that. If you think a bigger home or nicer things will bring you that happiness, it won't. Look at how many people are miserable after they win the lottery. It doesn't fix everything for them. If you are not content, then odds are materialism has a hold on you. And in the end times, this false religion is going to try to do that exact same thing. Use money to create it as an object of worship for people. And they're going to be miserable and mourn when their money disappears. Everything is going to revolve around money in this religion. They will worship inside of an economic system, and they're going to hate anyone, including Christians, who try to say differently. And in the end, all that money and materialism that they put their hope in, God is going to destroy it all. And we have a responsibility now as Christians to learn to live a life that doesn't depend on material things. So now let's look at Revelation 18:19. And they threw dust on their heads as they wept and mourned, crying out, "Alas, alas, for the great city where all who had ships at sea grew rich by her wealth. For in a single hour she has been laid waste. Rejoice over her, O heaven, and you saints and apostles and prophets, for God has given judgment for you against her." At this moment, church, we get some good news. At this point, the battlefield is set for the great end times battle. And the stage may look something like this image here. This is an artist rendition, but it may look something like that, which would be a pretty intimidating sight to see if you're there in person. So the Antichrist at this point, he's built this false religion of hate. He's built a prosperous economic system. He's built up kings and kingdoms. He's amassed an enormous army from all the nations east of the Euphrates and then beyond that. And they're coming after the people of God specifically. And for 7 years during this tribulation, God has allowed humanity to get what they've always wanted. I will leave you to yourselves. You want sex? Take it. You want money? Steal to your heart's desire. You want to fight? Hold nothing back. You want to worship false gods? Be my guest. And at this moment, as the army of the Antichrist lines up, quite possibly the biggest fighting force the world has ever seen, we come to this pivotal battle that we're going to look at next week. That final seal, church, marks something very important, or that final bowl. All the stress of the end that we've been looking at and going through at this point is now over. From this point on, what we are going to see is God's clear and decisive victory, and the process of building something good and new is going to begin starting next week. So church, be excited for next week's message because we get to hear about the hope that we've been waiting for through all of this nastiness this whole time. Because church, things are going to, at that point, get really, really good.